everybody, and welcome to another video in the IELTS Learning Tips series. And today's video is going to be about speaking. And I just want to talk about 4 things that you might consider when you are preparing for the speaking exam. Now, before we get on to that, I just want to remind you that if you want to contact me and chat to me even, I speak to students all the time about their IELTS, giving them advice. And if you don't have to work with me, but if you want to, then I have various programs and offers that you can take up. One of which is my IELTS Champions Club, which is a new thing that I started quite recently. You join it just like you join any club, gym or something like that, by paying a monthly subscription. And the subscription is $17. So it's quite a low subscription. And for that, you get my IELTS step-by-step course, which is a lesson every day. And we also have training in Facebook, and we have training on Zoom. And we have a beautiful study pod where students can go anytime to practice their speaking or hook up with each other to talk about IELTS and practice IELTS. So if you want to know about that, just contact me and I'll give you all the details. Okay, so on to speaking. I know for a lot of you, speaking is maybe not a big issue, but what I find again and again when I'm working with students, especially those students that are getting really high scores in listening and reading, they might be getting sort of 8.5s in their listening and reading, and their writing is pretty good too. And generally I'm working with them on their writing. And then we'll say, right, let's just have a little practice of the speaking. And often I'm quite shocked at how they perform in the speaking. And it's simply because they haven't practiced. And so again and again, I find really high-level students are getting lower scores in speaking simply because they don't have a method, they don't have a process for tackling the speaking. And at the end of the day, they don't practice enough. The thing about in fact, I'm going to tell you a little story before we get onto the slides. A few years ago, I worked for a big multinational company called Unilever, and we provided English language for their employees and their families. And we often worked with the wives of, they were mostly wives, I will say at that time. And the husbands very rarely took up language training, partly because they were too busy and partly because they could manage quite well in their jobs. But the wives and the children often needed extra support from us for their day-to-day language needs. So we worked with a lot of the wives, and we helped the children with their schoolwork in the beginning. And what we found was that the employees of Unilever, who were going to the office every day, they could manage very well within the office because the language that they used was fairly international. It was the same every day. You imagine if you're doing your job, you'll get the same language every day. And so you get quite fluent and you're quite at ease with it and everything. The wives, on the other hand, were doing multiple different things. So they were going to school, they were meeting other parents in the school playground, so they needed to be able to talk to other parents. They were meeting the teachers, so they needed to be able to talk to the teachers. A lot of them had other hobbies, so they might be joining a gym, they might have been going to other places, they might have joined some other clubs. So constantly their experience of living was varied, and so they needed to keep changing their vocabulary and learning new vocabulary and learning new language for these different scenarios. And what we found always at the end of their tour, which was generally 2 or 3 years, is that the women that we'd been teaching, the wives mostly, actually had much, much better English than the husbands, whose range in the office was quite limited. And after a little while, we then got calls to go into the office and actually teach the employees as well, because their main worry was, what do we do at lunchtime? What kind of topics do we talk about? How do I how do I start a conversation with my English colleagues? If we get invited to somebody's house at the weekend or in the evening, how do we manage that? So it was all the social English that they were worried about. So we started doing that too. So that's kind of long-winded way of saying, just because you use English at work does not mean that you'll have the breadth of English you need for the IELTS exam. So if you think the topics in IELTS speaking are not really that much related to work, they tend to be general things like books or newspapers or documentaries, or they might be about people you've met or friends. It's much more varied. And so I think it's quite important that you do practice so that you can get that breadth of vocabulary and breadth of language for these different topics. So with no more ado, let me get on, because that was quite a bit long-winded there. And I want to share some slides with you, if it will let me. Bear with me. There we go. Okay, so 4 things that you can do, or that you shouldn't do, sorry, 4 things that you should avoid when you're doing your speaking test. So we're always told what to do, but these 4 things are what you shouldn't do, because they're not going to help you. Okay, so the first thing, I'm sure you know this, is not to try and memorize answers. Now, I know this used to happen a lot in the past. I don't think it happens quite so much nowadays, but you shouldn't try and memorize an answer. And the worst thing you can do is to ask a friend who's got a 7 or 8 in speaking and try and memorize their answers, which I have heard people try to do as well. Examiners are trained to spot this. They can see immediately if you've memorized anything in the speaking and also in the writing. The questions are not going to be the same from test to test. The topics might be, the questions might be similar, but they're probably going to be slightly different. So you'll be answering a question that the examiner has not asked you, and that's a disaster. The questions might be more difficult than the one that you've practiced, but conversely, they might be a lot easier. And then with a memorized answer, you might be giving a very convoluted answer to something that is actually quite simple and that you could do much better off the cuff. That means without thinking. Your answer will most definitely be stilted. It will not be natural. That's what I mean by that. And if you're thinking about a memorized answer that you've learned, you're not going to be listening. And remember, this is a communication exam. It's about communication, and part of that communication is listening. And therefore, you won't be communicating properly either. So it's a really bad thing to do. The best thing to do is to treat it as a new experience, listen carefully to the questions, and then say what you want to say. Okay, don't say nothing. Long periods of silence are a bit of a disaster in IELTS. Now, a little bit of silence, obviously, if you're thinking, don't worry about. Don't gabble the whole way through, but don't clam up. If you don't have an answer, the examiner can't score you. So you have to say something. You don't really have a choice. If you don't speak, then the examiner has to think, right, what's the problem here? Has the person not heard the question properly? Do they not understand the question? Now, not understanding a question means that you're probably quite low level. So you may get marked right down to a low level when it's not a matter of understanding. It's just that you're thinking. So you have to react in some way. So don't sit there for a long time and not say anything. It makes the whole thing difficult and uncomfortable for everybody, and the examiner doesn't know what the reason is. You have to provide an answer. Use some fillers. Is okay, don't use it too much, but it's natural for us to go, like that. Or, oh, I haven't thought about that. or I'm not sure, but I think. All of these little things give you thinking time. Try to say something. If you haven't quite understood, then try a stab. So if they ask you a question and you're not quite sure, and this particularly in part 1, in part 3, if you really don't understand, I think you can ask the examiner to rephrase. But in part 1, it's not a good idea to do that. So try a stab and say, I'm not quite sure if this is what you mean, but I think, and then give your answer. The thing is, this is about communication. And if somebody asks me a question and I don't really understand the question, then what I'll say is, I'm not quite sure what you mean. Is it this? Is it that? And this is a part of communication. Okay, and this filling kind of language, don't say that's a very interesting question, because everybody says that, but there are other ways of doing it. But this filling language helps you to think and come up with an answer. Conversely, don't just keep talking. Some people, especially in part 1, just go off like a steam engine and keep going, keep going. This is communication. Communication is give and take. So in part 1, give a full answer. So not just yes or no, but a little bit more, but don't keep going. Otherwise, you get into a question that wasn't asked. So the examiner needs space to ask questions as well. If you keep your eye on the examiner while you're in the exam, then you'll know when they're ready to ask another question. And body language and eye contact is all part of communication, which is why it's so important that you practice this with other people, ideally. You can't do all of this if you're practicing it by yourself. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. I mean, even people with band 7 and 8, they make some mistakes. It's not the end of the world. It's communication. They're not looking for perfect grammar. However, having said that, if you make grammar mistakes, if you make pronunciation mistakes, if you make collocation mistakes or vocabulary mistakes, they will be noticed and they will add to the overall score. But the overriding thing about the speaking is communication. So if you make the odd mistake, it's not going to be the end of the world. And the problem with trying to be perfect is that you're thinking about tenses, you're thinking about what word to use, and that stops you being fluent. So if you practice this a lot, the words you need will come. Believe you me, they will come. And if they don't come, just use another word. So long as you give a good answer, that's fine. And remember that listening is just as important as replying to the question. You need to understand the question and think about what you want to say. So you have to listen well. Examiners are quite aware that this is not your first language. They're trained to try and put you at ease. I know some are probably better at it than others, and that's my experience too when I worked alongside other examiners. But most of them, they want you to do well. I've never met an examiner who does not want everybody to do well. And so they will do their best to make it a situation in which you can have the opportunity to perform. Whoops. Okay, sorry, my cursor's just gone a bit funny. And their purpose is to see how well you can communicate. And remember, fluency and pronunciation are 50% of the marks. Vocabulary and grammar are the other 50%. So it's not all about perfection. So speak naturally and clearly, focus on the question and what you want to say. That's where your mind should be. And then do practice, because if you practice, you'll find that this comes more easily. And so the last one is try not to be anxious. I know that's difficult when you're in an exam, and it is easier said than done. But if you've done a lot of work on this, and if you've had a lot of practice and studied well and prepared yourself well, you can only do your best. And with practice, preparation, working with other people, you can't do any more than that. And then that will be your best. Stay calm. as calm as you can, because the calmer you are, the easier it will be to think about what you want to say and to be, you know, more communicative. If you start to get a bit nervous, take a deep breath. Listen well and give your answers promptly and as accurately as you can. But remember, what's important is what you want to say and how well you give your answer and how spontaneously you give your answer. But the answer at the end of the day is really practice. So the more you practice, the better this will be, the easier it will be, and the less nervous and the more confident you will be. So the answer lies in practice. As with all of IELTS, improving skills only happens if you practice, practice, practice. Okay, so thank you. I'll leave that there. And I hope that you work on some of these things for your speaking. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.